Julia looked up at the dark sky, feeling the first raindrops fall on her face. She was sitting on a worn wooden bench in the town's central square, surrounded by lush trees that were now swaying in the cold night wind. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were dull and distant. She pulled the thin hoodie she was wearing closer to her body, trying to shield herself from the cold that was beginning to intensify. The 16-year-old had left home a few hours ago, after yet another heated argument with her parents. The relationship between them had been complicated for years, full of misunderstandings and unmet expectations. Julia felt that her parents never really understood her, or even tried to. They were good people. Her father, a respected accountant, and her mother, a dedicated teacher. But they seemed to live in completely different worlds from hers. As the rain got heavier, Julia recalled the events that had brought her there. She had planned to stay at her best friend Mariana's house after the fight. They had arranged it days ago, and Julia saw it as a chance to escape and stay away from the tense environment at home. However, upon arriving at her friend's house, she received the news that she had had to leave at the last minute with her parents to visit a sick aunt. Frustrated and not knowing where to go, Julia wandered through the city streets until she reached that square. Now, as the night advanced and the storm gathered, she felt more lost than ever. Her thoughts drifted to the friends she considered her true family, the group of young people with whom she spent most of her free time, sharing laughter, secrets, and experiences that her parents would never approve of. The rain grew stronger, and Julia quickly got up, seeking shelter. She ran to the facade of a small shop, squeezing under the narrow awning that barely protected her from the water. Shivering with cold, she hugged her own body, feeling her clothes, already partially soaked, clinging to her skin. It was at that moment that a gentle voice caught her attention. "Hey, young lady, you're going to catch a cold out there. Why don't you come in for a bit?" Julia turned around and saw a middle-aged man standing at the door of a barber shop. He had a kind face, framed by well-trimmed grey hair and a short, well-groomed beard. "No, thank you," Julia replied hesitantly. "I'm already on my way out." The man looked at the dark sky and then back at Julia. "This rain isn't going to let up any time soon. At least take a dry coat to keep yourself protected." Before Julia could protest, the barber quickly went into his shop and returned with a brown wool coat. He handed it to her with a warm smile. "My name is Joseph," he introduced himself. "Here, use this. You can return it to me another day." Julia hesitated for a moment, but the cold and the man's kindness convinced her. She took the coat, thanking him shyly. "Thank you, Mr. Joseph. I promise I'll return it soon." Joseph nodded. "Don't worry about it now. Just take care of yourself and go home safely once the rain stops." With those words, he went back inside the barber shop, leaving Julia alone again, but now wrapped in the comforting warmth of the borrowed coat. As the night progressed, the rain finally began to let up. The young woman, still unsure of where to go, decided to take a walk to clear her mind. The streets were almost deserted, with only a few occasional cars passing by, casting reflections on the puddles that had formed on the asphalt. As she walked, Julia slipped her hands into the pockets of the borrowed coat, seeking more warmth. It was then that her fingers touched something. Curious, she pulled out the object. It was an old photograph, slightly faded at the edges. Julia stopped under a streetlight to get a better look at the picture. In it, she saw a younger man she immediately recognized as Joseph, the barber. Beside him was a beautiful woman with dark hair, and in front of them, two smiling children, a boy and a girl, both with the same blue eyes as Joseph. She realized that this photo probably had enormous sentimental value for Joseph, and he hadn't even checked the pockets before lending the coat to a complete stranger. The kindness of that gesture hit her with full force. Without thinking twice, Julia turned around and started walking back to the barber shop. She didn't know exactly what she would say, but she felt she needed to return the photo as soon as possible. When she arrived in front of the barber shop, she saw that the lights were still on. Through the shop window, she could see Joseph arranging the chairs, clearly getting ready to close the establishment. With her heart pounding, Julia pushed the door, making the bell above it jingle softly. Joseph looked surprised to see her enter. "Hello again," he said with a warm smile. "Is everything okay?" Julia reached out her hand, holding the photo. I found this in the pocket of your coat. I thought I should return it." Joseph's face lit up when he saw the photograph. He took it carefully, as if it were the most precious object in the world. His eyes filled with tears, but the smile on his face only grew wider. "Thank you so much for bringing it back," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "This photo, it was taken on a very special day for my family." Julia watched as Joseph looked at the picture fondly. There was something in his expression that made her feel a pang in her chest, a mix of longing, love, and perhaps a bit of sadness. After a moment, Joseph turned his gaze back to Julia, and she noticed a change in his expression. The concern returned to his eyes. "May I ask, why were you alone in that square so late at night? Where are your parents?" The question caught Julia by surprise. She lowered her eyes, suddenly feeling embarrassed. I left home," she admitted in a low voice. "I didn't tell anyone." Joseph let out a deep sigh. He placed the photo carefully on the counter and gestured towards one of the barbershop chairs. "Please sit down for a moment," he asked gently. "I know you don't know me, and I'm just an old stranger to you, but I would like you to listen to me for a few minutes, if you don't mind." Julia hesitated for a moment, but something in Joseph's calm voice and sincere gaze made her accept. She sat in the barber chair, feeling strangely small in it. Joseph disappeared for a moment to the back of the store and returned with 2 steaming cups of tea. He handed one to Julia, who accepted it gratefully, feeling the comforting warmth of the drink in her hands. "You know," Joseph began, sitting in a chair next to her, "I had quite a complicated youth. My mother suffered from mental issues that at the time were neither well understood nor treated. My father, on the other hand, was always absent, either working or, well, avoiding problems at home." He paused, taking a sip of his tea before continuing. Julia listened attentively, surprised by the openness of this man she barely knew. "I grew up believing I didn't need them, that I could live without a family. I had 2 older brothers who tried to help me, but I was rebellious, stubborn. I thought I knew everything." Joseph smiled sadly, lost in his memories. "I sought in my friends what I didn't have at home. They seemed to understand me better, you know. I thought they were my real family. But when things got really tough, well, they disappeared. Who stood by me were my brothers and, surprisingly, my parents. Even with all their problems and limitations, they welcomed me and took care of me in my most difficult moment." He paused again, looking at the photo still on the counter. "Today, I was able to do differently with my own family, with my wife and my children. I'm not perfect, far from it, but I've learned to value what really matters." Joseph turned to Julia, his eyes full of understanding. "I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I imagine it might be something similar. Maybe you think your family is hopeless, but believe me, in the end, the ones who will be there for you are the people who truly love you, unconditionally. Your parents may not be perfect, no one is, but they care about you." Joseph's words hit Julia like waves, making her reflect on her own actions and feelings. She felt tears forming in her eyes, but she held them back. "Go home," Joseph said gently but firmly. "Give your parents a chance. I just wish I had had that opportunity to go back before going through everything I went through." Those words finally broke down Julia's barriers. Tears began to stream down her face, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. The idea of going back home seemed both frightening and comforting at the same time. I don't know if I can," she murmured between sobs. Joseph placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You are stronger than you think, Julia. And remember, taking the first step is always the hardest, but also the most important." Julia nodded slowly, still grappling with her conflicting feelings. She thanked Joseph for the tea and advice, promising to consider everything he had said. In an inexplicable way, there was something about Joseph that made her stop and listen to him, unlike any other time someone tried to give her advice. As she left the barber shop, Julia decided to try once more to stay at a friend's house. She called Carla, whom she considered inseparable, but to her disappointment, Carla gave a weak excuse not to take her in. That refusal was like a painful confirmation of Joseph's words. Julia found herself alone again on the city streets, but this time with a new perspective. The lights of the houses around her seemed more welcoming, each containing families with their own stories and challenges. With a heavy but determined heart, Julia made a decision. She would go home. The way back seemed longer than ever, each step laden with anxiety and expectation. When she finally reached her front door, Julia hesitated for a moment before turning the doorknob. Upon entering, she was greeted by the silence of the living room. Her parents were sitting on the sofa, both with expressions of concern on their tired faces. When they saw Julia, they immediately stood up. "Julia!" her mother exclaimed, running to hug her. "We were so worried. Where have you been?" His father joined the embrace, his voice trembling with relief. "Thank God you're okay. We thought the worst." The mother seemed desperate. She was angry, but at the same time seeing Julia there at home and well was a relief. Julia felt the tears return to her eyes, but this time they were different. Tears of remorse, relief, and surprisingly, love. She returned her parents' embrace tightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I made a mistake. Can we talk?" Her parents nodded, guiding her to the sofa. In the hours that followed, Julia opened her heart as she had never done before. She spoke about her fears, her frustrations, and her dreams. To her surprise, her parents listened attentively, without judgment. They also shared their own fears and insecurities as parents, creating a new level of mutual understanding. It was not an instant transformation. In the weeks that followed, there were still difficult moments and discussions. But something fundamental had changed. Julia and her parents were genuinely striving to understand each other better, to build bridges where there had once been walls. Julia began to spend more time at home, discovering shared interests with her parents that she had never noticed before. Her father surprised her with his literary tastes, something Julia had always secretly appreciated. Her mother, in turn, proved to be an excellent listener and advisor when Julia finally opened up about her problems at school. Gradually, the house that once felt like a prison started to become a refuge. Julia still kept her friends, but now with a new perspective, understanding the value of balancing these friendships with family bonds. A few weeks after that rainy night, Julia returned to Joseph's barbershop. She entered with a smile on her face, carrying the carefully washed and ironed coat. Joseph greeted her with joy. "Julia, it's great to see you. How are things?" Julia handed him the coat, her smile widening. "Much better, Mr. Joseph. I wanted to thank you. Your words that night, they changed everything." Joseph listened attentively as Julia talked about the changes in her life, about how she and her parents were striving to rebuild their relationship. His eyes shone with pride and emotion. "I'm so happy for you, Julia," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Always remember, family isn't perfect, but it's the foundation upon which we build our lives. Take good care of that foundation." Julia nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for that stranger who had become an unexpected mentor. She left the barbershop that day with a sense of peace and purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. As she walked back home, Julia reflected on how a simple act of kindness, the lending of a coat on a rainy night, had triggered a series of events that transformed her life. She smiled, thinking about how sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected sources. And so, with light steps and a full heart, she moved forward, ready to face the challenges that would come, knowing that she now had not only friends, but a strengthened family by her side. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.